April 17th, 1942. Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The tropical heat is already rising off the pierced steel runway as Flight Lieutenant Bill Bluey Truscott wipes sweat from his gloves. The air smells of fuel, dust, and burned oil, the permanent scent of a forward war base hanging on the edge of survival. Somewhere beyond the jagged wall of the Owen Stanley Mountains, Japanese forces are advancing. And today, the sky belongs to whoever dares take it. The ground crew pulls away from the olive-drab fighter crouched before him, a Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawk, its shark-like nose pointed toward the rising sun. The aircraft looks rugged, heavy, not elegant like the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 they've been hearing about in whispered mess hall conversations. The Zero is faster, lighter, deadlier in a turn, or so the Japanese believe. Bluey climbs into the cockpit, boots scraping metal, the heat already suffocating beneath the canopy. He settles into the seat and pulls the harness tight across his chest. Outside, the engine coughs, then roars alive. The Allison V1, 1710 engine, shakes the entire aircraft as thick smoke spits from the exhaust stacks. The vibration runs through the fuselage and into his bones, a mechanical heartbeat, promising either victory or death. In the distance, another Kittyhawk taxis into position, then another, within minutes. No, 75 Squadron. Royal Australian Air Force begins rolling down the strip, one after another, lifting into the burning sky above Papua. Below them, Port Moresby sits vulnerable, a thin strip of Allied resistance between Japanese expansion and Australia itself. If Port Moresby falls, the road to Australia opens, and everyone in the cockpit knows it. The radio crackles. Bandits reported north of Buna. Altitude unknown. Bluey tightens his grip on the control stick. Ahead, the mountains rise like broken teeth, their peaks hidden beneath drifting cloud. Flying here is dangerous even without enemy fighters, jagged ridges, sudden storms, and thin oxygen waiting to kill careless pilots. But today, the greater threat is moving fast toward them. Japanese air superiority in the early months of 1942 has been overwhelming. Their Zero fighters agile. Elegant machines have already carved through Allied aircraft across Southeast Asia. Pilots who survived early encounters speak of them with a mixture of respect and dread. Many Japanese aviators believe the war in the Pacific skies is already decided, and they laugh when they hear the Australians are flying Kittyhawks. Heavy aircraft, inferior climbers, poor turning radius, easy targets, at least. That's what they believe. High above the jungle canopy, the formation pushes north. The sky looks deceptively calm. Too calm. Then, contact. 11 o'clock high. Bluey snaps his head toward the call. Tiny black specks appear against the blue, distant at first. Almost harmless. But they grow quickly. Fast. Too fast. Japanese fighters. At least 8 of them. Zeros. They come diving out of the sun. Silver wings flashing like blades. For a split second, the world shrinks to instinct. Bluey hears his squadron leader bark through the headset. Break formation. Engage. The sky erupts into chaos. Zeros streak downward with terrifying speed, slicing through the Kittyhawk formation. Machine guns chatter. Sharp metallic bursts tearing through the thin air. Tracer rounds streak past Bluey's canopy. Bright. Deadly. Close. He yanks the control stick hard to the right. The Kittyhawk rolls, heavy but stable, dropping into a diving turn. The aircraft shudders under strain, but unlike the delicate Zero, the P-40 is built to endure punishment, and that difference is about to matter. Behind him, a Japanese pilot commits to the chase. Bluey feels it, that tightening pressure of being hunted. The Zero closes fast, its agility obvious in every movement. In a turning fight, the Kittyhawk would lose. Every Australian pilot knows this. They've been warned repeatedly. Never dogfight a Zero. Instead, they dive hard. The nose drops. Gravity takes hold. The Kittyhawk plunges toward the jungle below, gaining speed rapidly faster than the lighter Zero can safely match. Wind screams across the canopy. The jungle surges upward. Closer, closer, too close. At the last second, Bluey pulls up sharply, leveling just above the treetops. The aircraft roars forward, faster now than the pursuing Zero expected. Behind him, the Japanese pilot hesitates, unwilling to risk structural failure at such speeds. That hesitation saves Bluey's life. For the first time in months, the Australians begin to understand something crucial. The Kittyhawk isn't weaker. It's different. And in war, difference can become advantage. Above the jungle, the fight spirals into a scattered melee. Zeros slash through the air in graceful arcs, turning tightly, hunting aggressively. But the Kittyhawks respond differently, diving, climbing, striking, then breaking away before the Japanese can counter. It's not elegant. It's brutal, calculated, disciplined, and slowly, the laughter from Japanese cockpits begins to fade. 1-0 overshoots during a pursuit dive. A mistake. Bluey seizes the moment. He rolls left, lines up the enemy aircraft in his gun sight, a fleeting silhouette against the sky. His finger tightens. The 6.50 caliber machine guns erupt in thunder. The recoil shakes the aircraft violently as bright streams of tracer rounds streak forward. The Zero shudders under impact. Smoke begins to trail from its wing. Then flame. The aircraft rolls violently before plunging toward the jungle below, disappearing into the green void. Bluey exhales, only now realizing he'd been holding his breath. His first confirmed kill, but the battle is far from over. Across the sky, aircraft twist and dive in deadly ballet. Engines howl, guns hammer, and the horizon spins in disorienting motion. For the Australians, this is no longer just survival. It is adaptation, learning, changing, and somewhere among the Japanese formations, experienced pilots begin noticing something unsettling. These Australians are not fighting like expected. They are refusing the rules, refusing the fight on Japanese terms, and that realization, slow but unavoidable, marks the beginning of a shift in the skies over New Guinea. A shift that will cost both sides dearly, but will ultimately decide who controls the air above the jungle. May 4th, 1942, 7-mile airstrip. Port Moresby. Dawn comes slowly over the jungle, creeping through layers of mist that cling to the foothills of the Owen Stanley Mountains. The night rain still drips from palm leaves, tapping softly against sandbags and aircraft wings. But beneath the quiet, tension hangs thick. A mechanic wipes grease across his trousers as he steps back from a battered Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawk, its fuselage scarred with fresh bullet holes patched by hurried rivets. The aircraft looks tired. So do the men flying it. Inside a canvas operations tent, squadron leader Peter Huey Turnbull, commanding officer of No. 75 Squadron RAAF, studies a hand-drawn map pinned to a wooden board. Red grease pencil marks trace Japanese movements along the northern coast. Leh, Salamaua, Buna. Each name carries weight places where Japanese aircraft have already struck hard and fast. Behind him, pilots gather around a rough wooden table. Some sip lukewarm tea, others simply stare at the floor. They have already lost men. Too many. The early days over New Guinea have not been kind to the Australians. Japanese pilots, veterans from China and Southeast Asia, fly with terrifying confidence. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters dominate tight-turning engagements. In those first encounters, several Australian pilots had made the fatal mistake of trying to outturn them. Few survived that decision. Turnbull speaks quietly but firmly. We don't fight their fight. The room listens. You try to turn with a 0, you die. He taps the map. Our strength is speed. Dive. Hit. Climb. Break away. Boom and zoom tactics. Not elegant. Not heroic in the traditional sense, but survivable. And survival is the first step toward victory. Outside, the heat begins rising again. Humidity clings to everything: skin, clothing, metal. Engines struggle under tropical strain. Ammunition corrodes faster than expected. Even fuel behaves unpredictably in the oppressive climate. War in New Guinea is not just against Japan. It is against nature itself. Mosquitoes carry malaria through the camp with silent efficiency. Men who survive combat sometimes collapse days later, shaking with fever beneath thin canvas roofs. Every sortie becomes a gamble, not just against bullets, but disease, weather, and mechanical failure. Shortly before noon, the warning comes. Raid approaching, multiple aircraft heading south. The message spreads across the airstrip like lightning. Pilots sprint toward their aircraft. Ground crews pull away wheel chocks. Engines roar alive one by one, coughing thick smoke into the humid air. Within minutes, the Kittyhawks roll down the narrow strip, lifting into the sky as distant specks begin appearing along the horizon. Japanese bombers, escorted. Bluey Truscott pulls his aircraft into formation, scanning the sky as sweat trickles down his neck beneath the flight helmet. The radio crackles again. Zeros above the bombers. At least 10. The numbers aren't good. Not today. But the Australians launch anyway, because there is no choice. If the bombers reach Port Moresby unchallenged, the airstrip, their lifeline, could be destroyed. And without it, the defense of Papua collapses. At altitude, the bombers become visible. Large twin-engine silhouettes lumbering through the sky. Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers. Fast, long-range, deadly, but vulnerable without fighter escort. And above them, the Zeros circle like hawks guarding prey. Bluey hears Turnbull's voice over the radio. Stay disciplined. Strike fast. Don't linger. The Australians climb higher, positioning themselves above the formation. For a brief moment, silence settles. Then, attack! The Kittyhawks dive. Engines scream as gravity accelerates them toward the Japanese formation. The aircraft trembles under the strain of high-speed descent. Tracer rounds erupt across the sky. Bluey lines up on a bomber, watching its shape grow rapidly in his gun sight. Closer, closer. Then he fires. 6 machine guns roar, sending streams of .50 caliber rounds slamming into the bomber's fuselage. Pieces tear free, spiraling into open air. Smoke begins trailing from the bomber's engine. Behind him, Zeros react instantly. They dive fast, relentless. One Australian aircraft explodes in midair, a sudden burst of flame, followed by falling debris. No parachute, just smoke. The sky fills with twisting aircraft, gunfire, and shattered metal. The Australians refuse to turn. Instead, they strike, then break away. Again and again. Boom! Zoom. Break. Repeat. It feels unnatural at first, resisting the instinct to stay in the fight. But slowly, the logic becomes clear. Zeros chase aggressively, expecting turning engagements. Instead, they find targets vanishing into high-speed dives, then reappearing moments later from unexpected angles. The Japanese pilots begin to notice something unsettling. These Australians are not behaving predictably. They are learning. Below, Port Moresby trembles under falling bombs. Explosions tear into the airstrip's edges, sending fountains of dirt skyward. Anti-aircraft guns thunder from the ground, filling the sky with black bursts of smoke. Despite heavy escort, several bombers break formation under sustained attack. One trails fire. Another spirals downward toward the jungle. Victory comes in fragments, hard-earned, costly. Hours later, the surviving aircraft return to base. The landing strip is scarred, but still operational. Men climb from cockpits slowly, exhaustion visible in every movement. Ground crews count aircraft, one missing. Then another, then another. The losses are real, brutal, but something has changed. In the days that follow, reports begin arriving from reconnaissance units. Japanese bomber formations are becoming less aggressive, more cautious, more guarded. And among Japanese fighter pilots, a quiet realization begins forming. The Kittyhawk is not the fragile opponent they once mocked. It is resilient, powerful in a dive, deadly when used correctly. The laughter that once echoed inside Zero cockpits begins fading into something colder. Respect and concern. Because the Australians are no longer reacting, they are adapting. And adaptation in the brutal skies above New Guinea means survival. And survival means time. Time to learn. Time to improve. Time to take back the sky. August 25th, 1942. Milne Bay, Papua New Guinea. Rain hammers the tin roof of the operations hut like machine gun fire, not a gentle drizzle. A tropical downpour so thick it blurs the horizon into a gray wall of water. Mud swallows boots whole along the airstrip, turning every step into a struggle. Palm trees bend beneath violent gusts sweeping in from the coral sea. Inside the hut, a lantern flickers over a weather-stained map. Squadron leader, Keith Bluey, Truscott, leans over the table, tracing Japanese movements reported overnight. His finger follows the coastline toward Milne Bay, a place that, only months ago, had been little more than a remote jungle inlet. Now it is the front line, and the Japanese are coming. Reconnaissance reports confirm what many feared. Japanese naval landing forces are approaching the bay, supported by aircraft operating from nearby bases. If Milne Bay falls, the Japanese gain a forward airfield. From there, they can threaten Port Moresby again, and beyond that, Australia itself. Outside, mechanics work frantically beneath sheets of canvas stretched across aircraft wings. The rain soaks everything: tools, uniforms, ammunition crates. Humidity creeps into fuel systems. Mud clogs wheels. Engines choke on moisture. But the Kittyhawks must fly anyway. There is no alternative. Shortly after sunrise, the rain begins to ease. Fog hangs low over the bay, drifting slowly across the strip, like smoke from unseen fires. Then comes the call. Enemy aircraft reported approaching Milne Bay. Multiple formations. Pilots rush toward their aircraft. Boots slip in the mud. Hands grip wing struts, slick with rain. Engines ignite, coughing, roaring, shaking water from metal skin. Bluey climbs into his cockpit, adjusting the headset over damp hair. Rain droplets beat across the canopy as he checks his gauges. Oil pressure steady, fuel full, weapons armed. The radio crackles, Zeros escorting bombers. Altitude 10,000 feet. He exhales slowly. They fought Zeros before, but today is different. Today, the battle is not just for air superiority. It is for survival of the base itself. Moments later, Kittyhawks claw into the sky. Takeoff is dangerous in these conditions: muddy runways, low visibility, unpredictable winds. One mistake could send an aircraft skidding off the strip into jungle or swamp. But every pilot pushes forward, because below them, Australian infantry are digging defensive lines around Milne Bay, waiting for Japanese landing forces already approaching by sea. Without air cover, those men will face disaster. Climbing through the cloud layer, the sky suddenly opens into blinding sunlight above the storm. Then, contact. Dark shapes appear ahead. Bombers. Zeros above them. The familiar formation sends a chill down Bluey's spine. The same combination that had terrorized Allied forces months earlier. But this time, something is different. The Australians do not hesitate. They do not panic. They execute. Attack from above. Strike fast. Break away. The words drilled into memory now become instinct. Kittyhawks dive. Engines howl as the aircraft plunge toward the enemy formation. Japanese pilots react quickly, but not quickly enough. The first burst of Australian gunfire slams into the bomber formation before the Zeros can intercept. Tracer rounds carve bright streaks across the sky. One bomber lurches violently as shells tear through its fuselage. Smoke erupts from an engine, then flame. Below, it spirals downward toward the rain-soaked coastline. Zeros dive to intercept. Sharp, fast, deadly. But this time, the Australians refuse to turn with them. Instead, they split, dive, climb, strike again. Boom and zoom tactics, once experimental, are now refined into lethal rhythm. Bluey pulls his aircraft upward into a steep climb, then rolls over the top and dives again. A Zero passes beneath him, momentarily exposed. He lines up the gun sight. Fires. The recoil rattles the cockpit violently. Rounds strike the Zero's wing root. Metal fragments burst outward. The Japanese aircraft rolls uncontrollably before disappearing into cloud below. Another victory. Another lesson learned. But the sky remains crowded with danger. Japanese pilots, once confident, now face an unfamiliar problem. The Australians are no longer predictable. They strike hard, then vanish, return from unexpected angles. Attack with patience rather than aggression. And slowly, painfully, control of the skies begins shifting. Below, chaos unfolds along the beaches of Milne Bay. Japanese landing forces push inland through mud and mangrove swamps. Australian infantry fight desperate engagements in torrential rain, holding fragile defensive lines. Every bombing run stopped in the sky means fewer explosions on the ground. Every enemy aircraft destroyed means fewer reinforcements reaching the beaches. Air power now shapes the outcome of the battle below. Hours into the engagement, the tide begins turning. Japanese bombers arrive in smaller numbers, fewer formations, less coordination. Their supply lines, stretched across long distances, begin weakening under constant aerial attack. And Japanese pilots begin reporting troubling signs. Fuel shortages, aircraft losses, limited replacements. Meanwhile, Australian crews continue flying, again and again, even as exhaustion sets in, even as aircraft accumulate damage. Because now, they understand something critical. Victory will not come from one battle. It will come from persistence. Late that afternoon, Bluey returns to Milne Bay. The landing strip looks worse than ever. Churned mud, scattered debris, smoke rising from damaged structures. Yet it remains operational. Barely. Ground crews rush forward as he shuts down the engine. The sudden silence feels unnatural after hours of deafening combat. He climbs from the cockpit slowly, muscles stiff, ears still ringing from gunfire. Nearby, another pilot lands his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, but intact, alive. That matters most. In the following days, reports begin arriving from intelligence officers. Japanese aircraft losses are rising. Their bombing raids grow less frequent, less confident, less precise. And within Japanese command structures, an uncomfortable realization begins forming. The Australians are no longer defending. They are resisting, effectively, relentlessly. And Milne Bay, once expected to fall quickly, is becoming a trap. A place where Japanese momentum is breaking, where overconfidence is dying, and where control of the skies is slipping. One engagement at a time, high above the jungle. The once unquestioned dominance of Japanese air power is beginning to crack, not from a single battle, but from dozens, hundreds, thousands of calculated engagements fought by pilots who refuse to surrender the air. And somewhere among Japanese squadrons, a new thought begins spreading quiet. Unwelcome, impossible to ignore. The Kittyhawks are no longer targets. They are predators. September 1942. Skies over Papua and the Coral Sea. The jungle below looks peaceful from altitude, a thick green carpet stretching endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by winding rivers and scattered clearings carved into the wilderness. But the sky above it has become a battlefield of endurance. Not just skill, not just courage. Endurance. Because by September 1942, something irreversible has begun. Japanese air superiority, once unquestioned, is starting to fracture. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, like cracks forming in steel under repeated stress. Inside a Japanese forward airbase near Buna, mechanics work silently beneath canvas shelters. Aircraft stand, lined along the muddy perimeter. Mitsubishi. A-6M-0s and battered bombers showing signs of heavy use. Paint is chipped, engines strain. Spare parts grow scarce. This is no longer the confident Japanese force that swept through Southeast Asia months earlier. This force is tired, stretched, pressured. Fuel shortages have begun affecting mission planning. Flights once conducted daily are now delayed or reduced. Bombers that once launched in tight formations now depart in smaller groups. Fewer aircraft, fewer escorts, and every loss hurts more than before, because replacements are no longer guaranteed. Across the battlefield, Australian and Allied intelligence units begin noticing patterns. Enemy aircraft numbers are dropping. Reconnaissance photographs show empty revetments where aircraft once stood. Radio intercepts reveal frustration among Japanese command channels. Supply lines from northern bases are under constant threat. American bombers now strike staging areas. Australian fighters patrol aggressively. The skies are becoming contested, truly contested for the first time. At Milne Bay, the airstrip remains muddy, scarred, but functional. Aircraft take off despite the damage. Kittyhawks roar into the sky, their engines echoing across the mountains. Pilots who once feared every engagement now fly with calculated confidence, not arrogance. Confidence born from repetition, experience, survival. They know the strengths of their aircraft. They know the weaknesses of their enemy. And most importantly, they trust the tactics that kept them alive. Boom, zoom, break, repeat. One afternoon, radar stations report incoming formations once again. But this time, the warning carries a subtle difference. Smaller formation, fewer escorts. Pilots exchange glances. They notice it too. Japanese formations are shrinking. Something is changing. Moments later, Kittyhawks intercept. The engagement begins like many before diving attacks. Tracer fire, twisting aircraft cutting across the sky. But something unusual happens. Zeros disengage earlier than expected, not retreating in panic, but conserving fuel, preserving aircraft, avoiding prolonged engagements. This is not the behavior of a dominant force. This is the behavior of one under pressure. Meanwhile, below the clouds, Japanese ground forces struggle against worsening conditions. Supply shortages intensify, ammunition runs low, food becomes scarce. Tropical disease spreads through jungle camps with devastating effect. Malaria, dysentery, fatigue. The same environment that once challenged Allied forces now punishes Japanese troops equally, perhaps more severely, because their supply lines stretch longer, their reinforcements arrive slower, and their losses accumulate faster than replacements can arrive. Back in the skies, engagements continue daily, each one small, each one costly. Each one pushing Japanese forces closer to exhaustion. A Zero pilot returning from a mission lands heavily on a worn runway. His aircraft carries new scars. Bullet strikes across the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, sweat clings to his flight suit. Hands tremble slightly, not from fear, from fatigue. Months earlier, missions felt routine. Victory felt inevitable. Now, every sortie feels uncertain, dangerous, survivable but never guaranteed. For Australian pilots, the change is unmistakable. They begin noticing fewer aggressive maneuvers from Japanese fighters, less willingness to chase deep into Allied territory, more cautious formations, more defensive flying. It is subtle, but undeniable. The enemy is adapting not to dominate but to survive. Strategic reports soon confirm what frontline pilots have sensed for weeks. Japanese operational tempo is declining. Aircraft losses cannot be replaced fast enough. Fuel shipments face increasing disruption. And Allied forces, particularly Australian and American, are strengthening daily. New aircraft arrive. New pilots join the fight. New supply routes stabilize operations. Momentum shifts slowly but decisively. Then comes the confirmation that changes everything. Milne Bay holds. Japanese ground forces begin withdrawing. Their attempt to seize the base has failed. For the first time in the Pacific War, a major Japanese amphibious landing has been decisively repelled. It is not just a tactical victory. It is psychological, proof that Japanese forces can be stopped, defeated, driven back. In Japanese command circles, frustration deepens. Reports detailing aircraft losses pile across desks. Requests for reinforcements increase. Resources, once abundant, now feel limited. Decisions become cautious, calculated, less ambitious. Confidence, once unshakable, begins eroding, not from a single defeat, but from repeated resistance, repeated losses, repeated failures to achieve decisive victory. High above Papua, the skies that once belonged almost entirely to Japanese pilots are now shared, contested, dangerous, unpredictable. Australian Kittyhawks patrol aggressively, their presence becoming routine. Expected, feared. Japanese pilots still fight fiercely, still skilled, still dangerous, but no longer dominant, no longer untouchable. And in quiet moments between missions, Australian pilots begin noticing something strange. Silence. Not total silence. War still rages, but fewer aircraft overhead. Fewer bombers approaching. Fewer enemy formations on the horizon. The pressure that once felt overwhelming now begins easing. Slightly, gradually, but unmistakably. Japanese air superiority is not destroyed in a single battle. It collapses under weight. Weight of losses, weight of distance, weight of resistance. And at the center of that collapse stands a force once considered secondary, under-equipped, outnumbered, underrated, the Royal Australian Air Force. Yet even as Japanese power weakens, the war is far from over, because in the shadows of defeat, Japanese command begins planning something new, something desperate, something dangerous, a shift in thinking that will change the tone of the conflict, not just in the skies, but inside the minds of the men fighting it. And to understand what comes next, you must see the war through the eyes of the enemy. Late 1942. Japanese forward airfield. Northern Papua. Night settles heavily over the jungle. Not peaceful night. Oppressive night. Thick clouds choke the moonlight, leaving only dim lanterns scattered along the edge of the airstrip. The smell of fuel, wet earth, and burned oil hangs permanently in the air. Somewhere beyond the darkness, engines tick as they cool, metal contracting, breathing like wounded animals. Inside a rough wooden barracks, a young Japanese Zero pilot sits alone at a narrow table. His name is Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato, 23 years old. Once proud, still disciplined, but no longer untouched by doubt. Before him lies a small notebook, its pages filled with tight, careful handwriting, letters never sent, thoughts never spoken aloud. Because in the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, doubt is dangerous, silence is survival. Months earlier, Hiroshi had flown with absolute confidence. Training had been relentless, demanding, precise. He had mastered the Mitsubishi A-6M0, a fighter aircraft celebrated across the Pacific as a symbol of Japanese superiority. It was fast, agile, elegant in the sky. And in the early months of the war, it had seemed unstoppable. Enemy aircraft fell quickly. Allied pilots often appeared unprepared, inexperienced, hesitant, slow to adapt. Each victory reinforced belief, not just in skill, but in destiny. Japan was advancing, relentlessly, successfully. Victory felt inevitable. But Papua changed everything. The first encounters with Australian fighters had been surprising, but not alarming at first. The Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawks, flown by Australian pilots, lacked the turning ability of the Zero. In tight maneuvering combat, the outcome often favored Japanese pilots. Many early engagements confirmed this advantage, but something unexpected began happening. The Australians stopped turning. They stopped fighting the way Hiroshi had been trained to expect. Instead, they dove, attacked, vanished, returned from above, again and again. Boom and zoom. At first, it felt cowardly, dishonorable, not true combat. But over time, that opinion began changing, because those same tactics began destroying Japanese aircraft. Hiroshi remembers one particular mission clearly. A morning sortie escorting bombers toward Milne Bay. Weather conditions were poor, heavy cloud cover, scattered rain, visibility limited. Still, the formation advanced, confidence intact. Until the attack came, not from ahead, not from below, from above. Kittyhawks dropped from sunlight like falling blades. Gunfire erupted instantly. No warning, no time to react. One bomber burst into flames within seconds. Another spiraled downward, trailing black smoke. Zeros scrambled to intercept, but the attackers refused to engage in turning combat. Instead, they vanished into dives, only to reappear moments later. Each strike precise, each attack calculated, each pass devastating. Hiroshi chased one Australian fighter, briefly instinct, demanding pursuit. But the enemy aircraft accelerated rapidly in a dive, pulling beyond reach. The Zero, light and agile, lacked the speed to match that descent. For the first time, frustration replaced confidence. The enemy had refused to fight by familiar rules. Back at the airfield that evening, silence dominated the briefing room. Losses were discussed calmly, formally, without visible emotion. That was expected. Emotion was weakness, but beneath discipline, tension grew. Each missing pilot represented more than numbers. They were classmates, friends, men who had trained together for years. Now gone, without ceremony, without farewell. Weeks later, Hiroshi notices changes in command briefings. Instructions shift. New warnings appear. Do not pursue aggressively. Maintain fuel discipline. Avoid extended engagement. These were not orders issued by a confident force. These were survival measures, subtle but unmistakable. Fuel shortages soon became routine. Aircraft once launched freely now required strict approval. Some missions were canceled entirely, others flown with minimal escort. Bombers departing with fewer fighters felt vulnerable, exposed in ways previously unimaginable. Maintenance crews struggled to keep aircraft operational. Spare parts became precious. Engines pushed beyond safe limits. Every aircraft lost became harder to replace. Yet perhaps the most dangerous change was psychological. Fear did not dominate Japanese pilots. Fear was forbidden. But uncertainty began growing quietly, like rot beneath polished wood. Hiroshi notices it during missions, a hesitation before diving, a second glance at fuel gauges, a subtle awareness that survival was no longer guaranteed. Even victory felt costly now. Temporary, fragile. One evening, after returning from patrol, Hiroshi stands beside his aircraft as rain begins falling again. He runs his hand along the wing of his Zero, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm. Bullet scars remain visible despite quick repairs. Proof of survival, proof of vulnerability. He remembers how instructors once described the enemy: unskilled, undisciplined, inferior. That description no longer fits. Not here, not now. The Australians fight differently, not recklessly, not emotionally, but patiently, relentlessly, learning with every engagement, adapting faster than expected. Inside the barracks, Hiroshi writes again in his notebook. Short sentences, carefully chosen words. Not defeat, not surrender, but reflection. He writes about distance, about fatigue, about the unfamiliar feeling of fighting an enemy that refuses to collapse. And somewhere within those private pages, a thought begins forming. One never spoken aloud. Victory may not come quickly. Victory may not come easily. Victory may not come at all. Outside, thunder rolls across the jungle. Rain intensifies. Aircraft sit motionless beneath heavy clouds. Tomorrow will bring more missions, more risk, more uncertainty. But tonight, beneath dim lantern light, a realization spreads quietly among Japanese pilots. The Australians are not breaking, they are enduring. And endurance in a war of distance and attrition may prove more dangerous than aggression. Early 1943. Imperial Japanese Command Planning Rooms. The room is silent, except for the soft rustle of paper. Maps cover the walls, enormous charts stretching across entire sections of the Pacific. Red lines mark shipping routes. Blue symbols represent airfields. Black arrows indicate planned offensives. At first glance, the map still looks impressive. Japanese territory stretches across vast distances from Southeast Asia to the islands of the Pacific. But distance, once a symbol of victory, is becoming a burden, a dangerous one. Inside the room, senior officers review reports arriving from Papua and the surrounding regions. Each document carries the same troubling message. Losses are increasing. Aircraft, pilots, fuel, supplies, time, all draining faster than expected. The early victories of 1941 and 1942 had created momentum, rapid expansion across multiple fronts. But that expansion came with a hidden cost. Overextension. Too many bases, too many supply routes, too many distant battle zones requiring constant support. And now, maintaining that vast network is becoming impossible. One of the most critical mistakes begins revealing itself clearly: underestimating Allied logistics. Japanese planners had believed that distance alone would weaken Allied response, especially across the remote jungles of New Guinea. But instead, Allied forces adapted. Airstrips multiplied across Papua. Supply chains strengthened. Convoys began moving with greater protection. And most importantly, American industrial capacity began accelerating production of aircraft, weapons, and equipment. New fighters arrived steadily. Replacement pilots continued training. Losses, while painful, were recoverable. Japanese losses, however, were not. Every experienced pilot lost represented years of training gone forever. Japan lacked the time and infrastructure to replace them quickly. Back in the skies above New Guinea, this imbalance begins appearing in subtle ways. Japanese formations shrink. Pilot experience levels vary widely. Some new recruits arrive with limited combat training sent into dangerous missions sooner than intended. Their survival rates drop sharply. Veteran pilots begin carrying heavier responsibility, flying more missions, facing greater fatigue. Mistakes increase. Mechanical failures rise. Combat effectiveness declines. Another strategic error becomes clear. Rigid doctrine. Japanese air tactics, once highly effective, had been designed around early war success, tight formations, aggressive maneuvering, close-range engagements. These methods worked brilliantly against inexperienced opponents, but against adaptive forces like the Australians and Americans, rigidity becomes weakness. Allied pilots study enemy patterns carefully. They learn when Japanese fighters dive, how bombers approach targets, where escorts position themselves. And once those patterns are understood, they are exploited, relentlessly, repeatedly. Japanese forces attempt adjustments, but slowly, cautiously, too cautiously, while Allied forces experiment freely, constantly refining tactics. Japanese command structures resist rapid change. Tradition competes with innovation, and innovation begins winning. Meanwhile, supply shortages worsen. Fuel becomes the most critical concern. Without fuel, aircraft remain grounded. Without aircraft, air superiority collapses. Shipping losses at sea compound the problem. Allied submarines begin targeting Japanese supply convoys with increasing success. Each destroyed tanker carries consequences far beyond the immediate explosion. It removes future missions, future defenses, future victories. Inside forward bases across Papua, ground crews begin improvising repairs using salvaged components. Damaged aircraft become spare parts. Donors, engines once replaced routinely, are now repaired repeatedly, sometimes beyond safe limits. Pilots take off knowing mechanical failure is no longer rare. It is expected. For Australian forces, the shift becomes increasingly visible. Radar warnings become less frequent. Enemy patrols appear less aggressive. Bombing raids occur less often, and when they do, escorts feel thinner, weaker, less coordinated. Victory still demands effort, still demands sacrifice, but momentum has shifted, quietly, irreversibly. Perhaps the greatest mistake of all was not tactical, not logistical, but psychological. Overconfidence. Early Japanese victories had created a belief in inevitability, a perception that Allied forces lacked the discipline or resilience required for prolonged warfare. That belief delayed necessary adaptation. It encouraged expansion beyond sustainable limits. It reduced urgency when urgency mattered most. And by the time reality forced recognition, the cost of correction had become enormous. In Allied briefing rooms across Papua and Australia, intelligence officers now present encouraging updates. Enemy sortie rates declining. Aircraft losses increasing. Fuel shortages confirmed. The numbers speak clearly. Not victory yet, but progress. Real progress. For pilots in the skies, however, numbers mean little compared to survival. Each mission still carries risk. Each engagement still demands precision. And each mistake still carries fatal consequences. War does not end because strategy fails. It ends because forces collapse, and collapse takes time, pressure, persistence. By mid-1943, Japanese command begins shifting priorities. Defensive operations increase. Aggressive expansion slows dramatically. Focus turns toward holding territory rather than capturing more. This transition marks a turning point not just in operations, but in mindset. Offensive confidence fades. Defensive caution rises, and with that shift comes a quiet recognition. The war will not be short, it will not be easy, and it may not be won. High above the jungles of Papua, the skies remain dangerous, but no longer predictable, no longer dominated by a single force. Instead, they reflect the reality of prolonged conflict, contested, exhausting, uncertain. And somewhere within Allied command structures, a new phase of the war begins taking shape. Not survival, not resistance, but recovery. Preparation for something larger, something decisive. Because the next stage will not be about holding ground. It will be about pushing forward, reclaiming territory once lost, and proving beyond doubt that momentum has permanently changed sides. Mid-1943, the skies above New Guinea. The sound arrives before the aircraft are seen. A deep, rolling thunder spreading across the jungle canopy, not from a storm, but from engines, many engines, heavy engines. For months, the war over New Guinea had been defined by survival defending airstrips, intercepting bombers, holding fragile ground. Now, something has changed. The Allies are no longer waiting. They are advancing. At forward airfields scattered across Papua, new aircraft begin arriving in steady waves, not just replacements. Upgrades, stronger engines, better armor, improved firepower. Pilots gather along the edges of runways, watching unfamiliar silhouettes roll to a stop. Aircraft larger, faster, and built for long-range operations. American transport planes unload crates of spare parts, ammunition, and supplies faster than ever before. Fuel tanks fill rapidly. Maintenance crews work with renewed confidence. For the first time in months, shortages begin fading. Inside briefing tents, maps look different now. Red arrows, once representing Japanese expansion, are replaced by blue arrows pointing north, toward enemy-held territory, toward airfields carved into dense jungle, toward supply hubs feeding Japanese operations. Targets once considered unreachable are now within range, because Allied logistics have caught up and then surpassed. One of the most significant changes appears in the skies themselves. Escort formations grow larger. Bombers fly deeper. Fighter patrols extend farther from base. What was once defensive air warfare is transforming into offensive pressure. Daily, relentless, calculated. At dawn, Kittyhawks line the runway beside newer Allied aircraft. Engines ignite one by one. Exhaust smoke curls into humid morning air. Pilots perform final checks, but the atmosphere feels different now. Less desperate, more determined. Today's mission is not interception. It is strike. The radio crackles with instructions. Targets confirmed. Enemy airfield. Enemy fuel storage. Enemy supply depot. Destroy the infrastructure that keeps Japanese forces alive. Because war in New Guinea is no longer about dogfights alone. It is about strangling supply lines, cutting movement, breaking momentum. As aircraft climb into the sky, formations stretch across the horizon. Dozens of fighters escorting bombers deeper into contested territory. Japanese radar operators detect the incoming wave, but reaction times grow slower. Aircraft availability remains limited. Fuel reserves tight. Scramble orders still come, but fewer fighters respond. Over target areas, the jungle canopy suddenly erupts. Explosions tear through hidden airstrips. Fuel dumps ignite in towering columns of fire. Black smoke coils upward into the sky, visible for miles. Aircraft parked on the ground burn before they can even launch. Runways fracture under repeated bombing. Every destroyed strip removes another operational base. Every burning fuel tank removes future missions. Every lost aircraft removes experienced pilots Japan cannot easily replace. Japanese fighters that do manage to launch face overwhelming odds. Not impossible odds, but dangerous ones. Escort formations now contain experienced Allied pilots, veterans hardened by months of brutal combat. They no longer chase recklessly. They no longer panic under pressure. They execute with discipline. Attack in coordination, defend in formation, and withdraw with purpose. In the air, dogfights still erupt. Zeros remain deadly in skilled hands. But numbers matter. Coordination matters. Fuel endurance matters. And increasingly, the balance favors Allied forces. On the ground, Japanese commanders begin recognizing the pattern. Airfields once hidden by jungle cover are now known targets. Supply routes, once secure, are now under constant threat. Reinforcements struggle to arrive intact. Each day becomes a battle for survival rather than expansion. The initiative, once firmly Japanese, now belongs to the Allies. Australian pilots, many of whom survived the desperate early months, now find themselves flying missions that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Deep strikes, long-range patrols, offensive sweeps. They remember the days when merely defending Port Moresby felt like victory. Now, they fly beyond it, northward, toward territory once considered lost forever. One afternoon, after returning from a successful strike mission, ground crews gather around returning aircraft. Damage is still visible: bullet holes, scorched paint, shattered panels. War has not become easier, but it has become winnable. That difference matters more than anything. Meanwhile, intelligence reports confirm what frontline pilots already suspect. Japanese operational capability continues declining. Fuel shortages worsen. Aircraft losses increase. Pilot fatigue intensifies. And, perhaps most critically, defensive positioning replaces offensive planning. That shift signals weakness, not collapse. Not yet, but weakness. For Allied command, this moment represents a critical transition. Not victory, opportunity. Opportunity to apply sustained pressure, to deny recovery, to force retreat, and eventually to reclaim the skies completely, high above the jungles. The rhythm of war changes. No longer reaction, no longer survival. Now, advance, strike, withdraw. Repeat. Each mission pushes the front line farther north. Each destroyed base tightens the grip around Japanese operations. Each successful sortie reinforces belief among Allied forces that the tide has truly turned. And yet, even with momentum shifting, the war remains dangerous. Every mission still carries risk. Every dogfight still demands precision. Every mistake still carries deadly consequences. Victory remains distant, but no longer unimaginable. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new battles are already forming, new strategies being drawn, new objectives marked in red, because the counterattack has begun, and once begun it will not stop. Not until the skies are secured, not until the enemy retreats, not until the war itself changes direction forever. Late 1943. Northern Australia and Papua. The noise of war does not fade all at once. It fades gradually, like thunder rolling farther into the distance. By late 1943, the skies above Papua still carry danger. But something has changed, something deeper than tactics or aircraft. The men who once scrambled desperately to defend fragile airstrips are no longer the same men. They are veterans now, survivors, and their aircraft, the Kittyhawks, have become symbols of something larger than survival. They represent adaptation, endurance, refusal to yield. At airfields scattered across northern Australia and New Guinea, rows of weathered Kittyhawks sit beneath fading sunlight. Their paint is worn, their fuselage is scarred, their wings marked by countless repairs. Each dent tells a story. Each patch hides a moment when survival came within inches of failure. Ground crews walk between the aircraft quietly, running hands along metal surfaces, not just inspecting machines, but remembering the battles fought with them. These aircraft carried men through fear, through chaos, through history. For many pilots, memories return strongest in silence, not during combat, not during missions, but afterward, when engines stop and the world becomes still again. They remember the early days at Port Moresby, the fear of facing unknown enemies, the shock of losing friends during those first brutal engagements, the helpless feeling of being outmatched, and then slowly the transformation, learning new tactics, trusting discipline, replacing instinct with strategy. Survival became skill, skill became confidence, confidence became control. One of the most powerful lessons learned by these pilots was simple. Victory does not always belong to the strongest aircraft. It belongs to the most adaptable pilots. The Kittyhawk was never the most agile fighter in the Pacific, never the fastest climber, never the most technologically advanced, but it possessed strengths that mattered: durability, diving speed, and firepower. And when used correctly, those strengths became decisive. Australian pilots learned to fight smarter, not harder. They studied their enemy, respected their enemy, and then outmaneuvered them through discipline rather than pride. In briefing rooms, new pilots now listen carefully to veterans recounting lessons learned in blood. Stories are told not for glory but for survival. Never turn with a zero. Use altitude like a weapon. Speed is life. These phrases become doctrine, repeated until instinct replaces hesitation. Because every new pilot entering the war inherits knowledge written by those who came before. Knowledge bought at tremendous cost. Across Allied command structures, recognition of Australian contributions begins growing. Their early resistance in Papua had bought time, precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Time for supply chains to strengthen. Time for strategy to evolve. Without those early defensive victories, later counterattacks might never have happened. The defense of Port Moresby, the survival of Milne Bay, these moments became turning points, not because they ended the war, but because they prevented disaster. They stopped momentum. And once momentum stops, it can be reversed. Back in Japan, surviving pilots carry their own memories. Different, heavier, marked by frustration rather than triumph. They remember the first encounters with Allied fighters who refused to fight by familiar rules. They remember supply shortages growing worse, aircraft numbers shrinking, confidence fading, and gradually, respect replacing arrogance. Because in war, respect often arrives too late. For Australian pilots, legacy is not measured only in victories. It is measured in survival, in endurance, in the ability to continue flying despite fatigue, fear, and loss. Many of them lost close friends. Wingmen, instructors, men who once laughed beside them in briefing tents. Now con, remembered only through photographs pinned to barrack walls. At memorial services held across Australia, names are read aloud slowly. Each name echoes across quiet crowds. Families listen, some standing rigid, some gripping photographs, some staring silently into the distance. Behind every victory lies sacrifice. Behind every aircraft returned safely lies another that never came back. War never delivers triumph without cost. Never. Yet despite loss, pride remains. Not pride built on arrogance, but pride built on perseverance. Because when the early months of the Pacific War threatened collapse, it was pilots, flying aging Kittyhawks, who stood between invasion and survival. They fought when odds favored the enemy. They adapted when defeat seemed inevitable. And they endured long enough for the tide to turn. Today, historians often speak of large battles, major offensives, massive naval engagements, decisive turning points. But beneath those famous moments lies a quieter truth. Victory is built from thousands of small engagements, hundreds of individual decisions, dozens of pilots refusing to quit. The legacy of the Kittyhawk pilots is not defined by a single battle. It is defined by persistence, daily resistance, repeated courage. Even decades later, restored Kittyhawks occasionally take to the skies during commemorations. Their engines roar once again, not in war, but in remembrance. Crowds gather below, watching the aircraft pass overhead. For older veterans standing among them, the sound triggers memories instantly, not always pleasant, but always powerful. The roar of the engine becomes more than noise. It becomes memory, history, proof that survival was possible. In quiet moments, long after the war ended, many veterans reflected on what truly mattered. Not medals, not recognition, but survival their own, and that of their nation. Australia remained free. Port Moresby never fell. Milne Bay held. Momentum reversed. History changed. And they had been there, inside the cockpit, when that change began. The Kittyhawk pilots did not win the war alone. No single force ever does. But they bought something invaluable. Time. Time for reinforcements. Time for strategy. Time for hope. And in war, time is often the difference between collapse and survival. As the sun sets beyond the horizon, casting long shadows across silent airstrips, the legacy remains, not carved into stone alone, not written only in books, but carried in memory, in history, in the quiet understanding that courage is not defined by victory alone. It is defined by endurance and the willingness to stand even when standing feels impossible. Early 1942. The moment when everything hung by a thread. History often remembers victories as inevitable. Clean, certain, almost guaranteed. But the truth is far more fragile. Because in the early months of 1942, Australia stood closer to disaster than most people today realize. Closer than comfortable memory allows. Closer than official reports once admitted. At that time, Japanese forces had already achieved stunning victories across the Pacific. Hong Kong had fallen, Malaya had collapsed, and the British stronghold of Singapore, once believed to be impregnable, surrendered in a shocking defeat during the fall of Singapore. For Australia, the news landed like thunder. Singapore had been seen as the shield protecting the region. Its collapse shattered that illusion overnight. Suddenly, the northern approaches to Australia looked exposed, unprotected, vulnerable. Only days later, Japanese aircraft struck northern Australia directly during the bombing of Darwin. Explosions tore across the harbor. Ships burned. Buildings collapsed. Smoke filled the sky over the coastal city of Darwin. For many Australians, this moment marked the end of distance as protection. War had reached their shores, not in theory, not in headlines, but in fire and destruction. Across the Pacific, Japanese expansion continued. Island after island fell. Airfields multiplied across newly captured territory. Each new base brought Japanese forces closer to Australia's northern approaches, closer to strategic targets, closer to supply routes, closer to cities, and among military planners. A terrifying possibility began circulating quietly. Could Australia itself be invaded? The question was not asked publicly, but privately among officers studying maps late into the night. It felt disturbingly real. At Port Moresby, the situation appeared especially dangerous. This remote outpost in Papua became the critical gateway to Australia. If Japanese forces captured it, they would gain a launching point for further operations southward. Air power from Port Moresby could threaten northern Australia directly. Shipping routes could be disrupted. Defenses weakened, momentum lost, and once momentum shifts toward collapse, recovery becomes extremely difficult. The Japanese understood this. That is why Port Moresby became such a central objective, not simply for territorial expansion, but for strategic control. Control of airfields, control of movement, control of the region's future. The skies above Papua became the testing ground where disaster might either be prevented or unleashed. Early in the conflict, Japanese aircraft dominated many engagements. Their pilots were experienced, their aircraft highly capable, their confidence unshaken. Allied forces, by contrast, struggled with shortages of aircraft, fuel, and trained personnel. Every mission carried enormous risk. Every loss felt catastrophic. Because replacements were scarce, time felt limited. But something extraordinary happened during those desperate months. Instead of collapsing under pressure, Australian forces adapted. They changed tactics, improved coordination, strengthened defensive positions, and most importantly, they refused to surrender critical ground. The defense of Port Moresby did not end with a single dramatic battle. It was built day by day, mission by mission, decision by decision. When Japanese forces attempted to seize Milne Bay, expectations favored rapid victory. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance, rain-soaked terrain, slowed movement. Air attacks disrupted supply lines. Infantry defenses held firm, and gradually, unexpectedly, the attack failed. This moment became one of the earliest examples of Japanese forces being pushed back rather than advancing forward. It changed perception, not just among Allied forces but within Japanese command itself. The significance of these early defensive victories cannot be overstated, because had Port Moresby fallen, had Milne Bay collapsed, had Australian air resistance failed, the consequences would have extended far beyond Papua. Northern Australia would have faced increasing vulnerability. Supply routes linking the United States and Australia might have been severed, reinforcement efforts delayed, counterattacks postponed, momentum lost permanently. Historians now agree that the margin between survival and disaster was remarkably thin, measured not in years, not even in months, but in weeks, sometimes days. A few successful bombing runs, a few failed interceptions, a few destroyed airstrips. Any of these could have tipped the balance toward collapse. That is how close Australia came to disaster, closer than many generations realized. Even today, military analysts study this period carefully, not simply to understand the past, but to understand how fragile victory can be, how easily momentum can shift, and how survival often depends not on overwhelming strength but on resilience, on persistence, on refusing to give up ground when retreat feels easier. For the pilots who flew those early missions, history was not abstract. It was immediate, personal, dangerous. They did not think about long-term strategy. They thought about survival, about defending the runway beneath them, about protecting the aircraft beside them, about returning home alive. Yet unknowingly, their actions helped prevent one of the most dangerous scenarios Australia had ever faced. As the war progressed, larger battles captured headlines, massive naval engagements, major amphibious invasions, strategic bombing campaigns. But behind those famous moments lies an uncomfortable truth. If Australia had failed during those early months, many of those later victories might never have happened. The survival of Port Moresby, the defense of Milne Bay, the resistance in Papua, these moments did not guarantee victory, but they prevented defeat. And sometimes, preventing defeat is the most important victory of all. As historians reflect on the war today, one realization becomes clear. Australia did not simply win battles. It survived a moment when survival itself was uncertain, and that survival changed the future of the Pacific War. Present day, Northern Australia. The air is calm, too calm to imagine war. Sunlight stretches across a quiet airfield somewhere in Northern Australia, where the runway now lies smooth and silent under a wide blue sky. No alarms, no smoke, no scrambling pilots racing toward engines already roaring. Just stillness and memory. A small crowd gathers along the edge of the runway. Families, veterans, young children sitting on their parents' shoulders. Some hold cameras, others simply watch. They are waiting, not for battle, but for remembrance. Then, in the distance, a sound, faint at first, almost mistaken for distant thunder, but steadily growing louder, deeper, more mechanical. The sound of a single aircraft engine rolling across the horizon. Heads tilt upward, eyes narrow toward the sky. And then it appears, a restored Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawk, its polished metal reflecting sunlight as it sweeps across the airfield in a wide, steady pass. The same aircraft type that once clawed into violent skies over Papua. The same machine that carried young pilots into danger when defeat felt dangerously close. Now flying not in war but in tribute. The engine roars overhead, a powerful, unmistakable sound. For younger spectators, it is impressive. For older veterans standing quietly in the crowd, it is something deeper. It is memory, instant, unavoidable. The sound pulls them backward through time, back to humid jungles, back to muddy airstrips, back to moments when every takeoff might be the last. Some veterans stand with rigid posture, others grip walking sticks tightly. A few close their eyes as the aircraft passes overhead, not from discomfort, but from remembrance. Because that sound once meant survival, or loss, or both. As the Kittyhawk circles again, sunlight glints along its wings. Fresh paint hides the scars once carried into combat, but the shape remains unmistakable. That long nose, that broad wing, that unmistakable silhouette cutting through open sky. The aircraft represents more than engineering. It represents endurance, adaptation, refusal to surrender. In museums across Australia, restored aircraft stand silently beneath bright lights. Visitors walk slowly past them, reading plaques that describe dates, locations, and battles. Names etched into metal panels tell stories without voices, stories of pilots who never returned, stories of airfields that nearly fell, stories of decisions made under impossible pressure. Each aircraft becomes a witness to history, a survivor. Yet the true legacy does not live only in metal. It lives in memory, in the stories passed from generation to generation, in classrooms where children learn about distant battles fought long before they were born, in documentaries replaying grainy footage of aircraft lifting into uncertain skies, and in quiet conversations between veterans and families, moments when memories finally find words. The war itself ended decades ago, but its echoes remain, not as explosions, not as gunfire, but as lessons. Lessons about preparation, about resilience, about how close disaster can come and how determination can push it back. Historians often measure war using numbers. Aircraft destroyed, missions flown, territory gained or lost. But numbers alone cannot capture the human reality behind those events. They cannot measure fear felt before takeoff. They cannot measure relief after landing safely. They cannot measure the weight carried by those who never returned. As the Kittyhawk completes its final pass, the engine noise slowly fades into the distance. Thunder becomes whisper. Whisper becomes silence. And once again, the airfield grows quiet, still, peaceful, unrecognizable from the chaos it once endured. But for those who understand history, the silence itself carries meaning, because it represents something hard-earned, not gifted, not accidental, earned through sacrifice, through endurance, through countless decisions made under pressure. Australia did not face invasion. Port Moresby did not fall. Milne Bay held. Momentum reversed, and the war turned. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because enough people refused to surrender when surrender seemed likely. That is the truth history leaves behind. Not inevitability, but survival. The aircraft disappears beyond the horizon. The sound fades completely. Yet in memory and history, the echo remains. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, resistance can change the future. And sometimes, the difference between disaster and survival is measured not in strength, but in persistence.